Welcome to a new episode of Inside the Economist's Mind. Today we're diving deep into, well, a really key piece of data economists watch very closely here in Australia. The Australian Bureau of Statistics Wage Price Index. You'll often just hear it called the WPI.
That's right. It's that number we all see reported every quarter. Wages grew by X%. But that single figure, it's really just the tip of a very carefully constructed iceberg.
Yeah, and understanding how the ABS actually puts that number together is, well, it's crucial if you want to grasp what it's really telling us about wage pressures in the economy.
Absolutely. It's more than just one number. There's a whole methodology behind it.
It's easy to hear wage growth and immediately think about, say, your own pay rise. But that might include a promotion or maybe a bonus, maybe you worked more hours. The WPI, though, it's trying to nail down something much more specific.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to unpack the sources we've got, the ones that lay out the ABS's detailed approach for the WPI.
We want to pull out the most important insights for you, the listener. So when you see that headline WPI figure, you'll know precisely what kind of wage change it represents.
And, crucially, what it doesn't represent.
Okay, let's get straight into that core idea then.
Yeah.
What is the WPI fundamentally trying to measure? And maybe just as important, what is it trying to avoid measuring?
Right. So the main goal, the fundamental aim, is to measure changes over time purely in the price of wages and salaries. And critically, it's for a constant quality and quantity of work.
Constant quality and quantity, like keeping the job itself the same.
Exactly. Think of it like measuring the price of a standard loaf of bread over time. You don't want the price change you measure to be because the bakery suddenly made the loaf twice as big or started using fancy organic flour.
You just want to know if the price of that specific loaf, the standard one, went up or down.
Precisely. It's about isolating that pure price tag on a unit of labor and stripping away all the other changes.
So the ABS works hard to make sure the index movements are not influenced by.
Yeah.
What exactly?
Well, several things. Changes in the actual nature of the job, like if someone gets promoted and takes on new tasks or responsibilities, that's out.
Okay.
Changes in the quantity of work, so working more hours or fewer hours, that doesn't affect the WPI calculation for the hourly rate.
Right, no overtime effect.
Correct. Also, changes in the characteristics of the employee doing the job. So if the person in the job gains more experience, gets new qualifications, or just gets older and moves up an automatic pay scale increment based on service length, none of that should move the WPI.
Even changes in location.
Even changes in location, it's really focused on the price of the job specification itself.
So just to be clear, if I get paid more because I moved into a higher paying management role, or I worked a ton of overtime last quarter, or maybe I just hit my 5-year service milestone and got an automatic bump, none of that flows into the main WPI increase.
That's exactly it. The WPI is tracking the rate of pay for what is essentially the same defined job over time.
Okay. And the ABS publishes a few different versions of the WPI, don't they?
They do. You'll see figures for ordinary time hourly rates and total hourly rates. And for both of those categories, they publish versions that exclude bonuses and versions that include bonuses.
And there's a really important distinction there about which ones are the pure price indexes.
Yes, absolutely. Only the indexes that specifically exclude bonuses and commissions are considered the pure price indexes.
Why is that? Why exclude bonuses?
Well, because bonus and commission payments, they can often fluctuate quite a bit based on things like individual performance or maybe company profits. And those factors can reflect changes in the, let's say, quality or quantity of work performed, or just how well the business did. They don't necessarily reflect a pure change in the underlying wage rate for the job itself.
That makes a lot of sense. So when we hear the main WPI figure reported, the headline number, it's almost always one of the excluding bonuses measures.
Generally, yes, because that's the one really trying to capture that cleaner signal of underlying wage rate pressure in the economy.
Okay, got it. So we know what they're trying to measure, this pure price of labor. How on earth do they actually collect the data to do that? It sounds tricky.
It involves a pretty sophisticated quarterly sample survey. The ABS surveys a sample of businesses' employers across both the private and public sectors all around Australia.
But not every employer.
No, there are some exclusions. For example, they don't include agricultural businesses or private households employing staff or foreign embassies. Those are out of scope.
And how big is this sample? Are we talking thousands of businesses?
They start with a sample of around 3,300 organizations, give or take. But here's the crucial part. From those organizations, They collect data on approximately 20,000 specific eligible jobs each quarter.
20,000 specific jobs.
Yes. And this is where that constant quality idea really comes into practice. They use what's called a longitudinal approach.
Longitudinal, meaning they track the same jobs over time.
Exactly that. They track the pay rate for the same specific job definitions within those sampled organizations quarter after quarter.
Wow. So not just accountant in general, but maybe senior accountant, pay grade 5, Sydney office.
Precisely. They select a specific job description, like that senior accountant example, and they collect the pay rate for that specific position over time. This is really key because it lets them isolate changes in the pay rate for that job description, even if the actual person holding the job changes.
So the person could leave, someone new comes in, but as long as the job spec is the same, they keep tracking its pay rate.
That's the idea. They actually expect businesses to keep providing data for their selected jobs for at least 5 years, ideally.
That's fascinating. So they're literally building the index by checking the wage rate for, you know, level 5 registered nurse at Royal Melbourne Hospital or qualified electrician at XYZ Manufacturing in Perth over many, many quarters.
That's a great way to put it. Now, regarding which employers get sampled for this data collection, they generally sample businesses with 5 or more employees.
What about the really small ones, micro businesses?
Good question. Micro businesses, the ones with 0 to 4 employees, are actually out of coverage for the quarterly data collection itself.
Why is that?
Well, ABS research found that their pay change patterns tend to be broadly similar to slightly larger businesses, and collecting data from them every quarter is quite resource intensive. However, and this is important, they are still in scope for the weighting process.
Meaning their contribution to the total wage bill is counted when calculating the national index, even if they aren't directly surveyed each quarter.
Exactly. Their weight is estimated based on broader economic data. Also, certain types of jobs are completely out of scope too, like permanent Defense Force personnel, or jobs that are commission only where there isn't a set pay rate, or roles that are very short-term, expected to last less than 6 months.
Okay, so meticulous tracking of pay rates for a large sample of specific ongoing jobs in medium to large organizations. But obviously a job in, say, the mining sector might have a different impact on the national wage bill than one in retail. How do they account for the relative importance of different jobs?
Ah, yes, that's where weighting comes in. And there are actually two distinct types of weights used.
Good.
First, you have sample weights. These are pretty standard for surveys. They basically ensure that the sample of businesses and jobs they've collected data from accurately represents the broader distribution of jobs across different states, industries, and sectors in the whole Australian labor market. They use employment data to scale things up.
So if, say, healthcare makes up 15% of total employment nationally, the healthcare jobs in their sample will be weighted so they collectively represent about 15% of the total weighted sample.
Pretty much, yes. It makes the sample representative of the population structure. But then there's the second type, which is arguably even more crucial for the WPI, expenditure weight.
Expenditure weights
Eh,
based on spending.
Exactly. These weights measure the relative importance of different groups of jobs. The ABS calls these elementary aggregates, typically based on categories like state or territory, public-private sector, and industry, based on how much employers collectively spend on wages and salaries within those specific categories.
So it's not just the number of jobs in a category, but the total wage bill for that category. A high-paying industry could have a bigger weight even with fewer jobs.
Precisely. A category with fewer but very highly paid jobs might carry a higher expenditure weight than a category with many more jobs but much lower average salaries.
And where does that spending data come from?
That information comes from another big ABS survey, the Survey of Employee Earnings and Hours, usually called the EEH.
Right. And these expenditure weights, they don't stay the same forever, do they? The economy changes.
No, they don't. The ABS performs reweighting. Generally, they do this every 2 years using the latest available EEH data. The last one was based on the 2023 EEH, influencing the index from the December 2023 quarter onwards.
And that reweighting is vital to keep the index relevant, right? As industries grow or shrink in importance.
Absolutely essential. It ensures the WPI continues to reflect the current structure of the Australian economy in terms of where the wage spending is happening.
When they reweight, they don't just reset the index back to 100 or something.
Oh no, definitely not. They use a technique to link the old series with the old weights and the new series with the new weights together seamlessly. So the historical time series remains consistent. It's an update to the index's internal structure, not a break in the data.
That makes perfect sense for keeping it current and useful over time. Okay, let's switch gears slightly to interpreting the numbers. The WPI is published as these index numbers, starting at 100 in a base period. But you often hear that you can't just compare, say, the index number for New South Wales to the one for Victoria and say wages are higher in one place, right?
That's absolutely correct. It's a really common misunderstanding. The index numbers themselves, like 150.2 or whatever, are kind of arbitrary points on a scale. They're set to 100 in a chosen base period. Currently, that's the September quarter of 2008. Their only purpose is to measure change over time from that base period or between any 2 points in time.
So you use them to calculate percentage changes.
Exactly. Quarter-on-quarter change, through the year change, financial year change since the base period. That's what they're for.
So if an index for a particular group went from, say, 150.2 in March 2024 to 155.3 in March 2025.
Yep, the change is 5.1 index points, and the percentage change would be calculated as 155.3 minus 150.2 divided by the starting value, 150.2, then multiply by 100.
Which gives you, let's see, about 3.4%.
Sounds right. And that 3.4% tells you the pure wage price change for that specific job category over that particular year. The ABS helpfully calculates and publishes these percentage changes for various levels of detail, industry, sector, state, etc.
Now, the ABS also puts out something else, an analytical series, looking at contributions to wage growth based on how pay is set. Awards, enterprise agreements, individual arrangements. What's that trying to show?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That series aims to help users understand which of those different pay-setting methods are contributing the most to the overall WPI movement in any given period. It's like another lens on the data. Is the growth being driven more by minimum wage rises flowing through awards, or by newly negotiated enterprise agreements, or by individual contract reviews?
It gives you a sense of the drivers behind the headline number.
Exactly. And they actually updated the methodology for that specific analytical series fairly recently.
Oh, really? When was that?
In the June quarter of 2023. The main change was about aligning the weighting used within that specific analysis more closely with the actual share of the total wages bill paid under each method awards, EAs, and individual arrangements again, drawing on data from the EEH survey.
So they refined how they calculate the contribution of each pay method using slightly different groupings than the main WPI.
That's right. For this particular analysis, they grouped jobs differently, focusing more on sector combined with pay-setting method rather than the state sector industry breakdown used for the main WPI weights.
Did that change have a noticeable impact on what the analysis showed?
According to the ABS, yes, it did. The revised method tended to show an increased contribution from jobs paid under awards, especially noticeable in the September quarters.
Which is typically when the big Fair Work Commission minimum wage decisions flow through.
Precisely. And that increased contribution from awards was offset by correspondingly decreased reported contributions from enterprise agreements and individual arrangements in those same quarters.
So it didn't change the overall WPI growth figure itself.
No, the headline WPI was unaffected.
But it changed the story slightly about where that growth was coming from, attributing more to award movements.
Correct. It's a good reminder that how you slice and dice the data, the specific methodologies used even for analytical series, can shape the interpretation of the underlying drivers.
Definitely highlights the nuances. Okay, last major area to cover. The statistical adjustments the ABS makes. Let's talk seasonality and trend. What kind of seasonality does the WPI even have? It's not like retail sales peaking at Christmas.
No, it's quite different. WPI seasonality is largely institutional, not driven by weather or typical holidays. It comes from predictable timing patterns in how wages are set, like when large batches of enterprise agreements tend to expire and new ones come into effect. But the biggest driver, historically and currently, is the timing of major minimum wage decisions. The decisions made by the various industrial relations bodies over the years, the old safety net reviews, then the Australian Fair Pay Commission, and now the Fair Work Commission.
Because their decisions often implement increases for millions of workers on awards all at once, usually around the same time each year.
Exactly. Those decisions, especially when they were concentrated in a specific quarter, create a noticeable seasonal bump in wage growth for that period.
So seasonal adjustment is basically removing that predictable annual bump and any other regular timing effects to show the underlying change.
That's the goal. It's a statistical process to filter out those systematic, calendar-related effects. It helps you see the smoother underlying movements from one quarter to the next without being potentially misled by the usual seasonal patterns or administrative timings.
And how do they do that? What method?
They currently use what's called concurrent seasonal adjustment. This method uses all the available historical data right up to the current quarter to estimate the seasonal factors.
Does that mean the seasonally adjusted numbers can change slightly later on?
Yes, that's a characteristic of concurrent adjustment. Because the estimate of the seasonal pattern can be refined slightly as new data points for future quarters become available, the seasonally adjusted figures for recent quarters can see small revisions. They also use statistical techniques, specifically AIR-MA modeling, to help forecast the series 1 year ahead, which helps stabilize the seasonal factors and reduce the size of these potential revisions.
I seem to recall they paused or changed this during the early days of COVID-19.
You're right, they did. Things were so volatile and uncertain back then, it was hard for the models to distinguish between genuine changes and just massive, irregular shocks from the pandemic. So, between the June quarter of 2020 and the March quarter of 2022, they temporarily switched to a simpler method called forward factors, which essentially locked in the seasonal pattern based on pre-COVID data.
But they switched back once things calmed down.
Yes, as the series started showing more stable patterns again, they reverted to the standard concurrent adjustment method from the June quarter 2022 onwards.
Okay, that covers seasonal adjustment. What about trend estimates? How are they different?
Trend estimates aim to go a step further in smoothing the data. They take the seasonally adjusted series and apply another layer of smoothing, specifically using something called a Henderson-weighted moving average.
And the point of that is?
To remove any remaining irregular fluctuations or sort of one-off blips in the seasonally adjusted data, the goal is to reveal the underlying direction or the longer-term trend of the series more clearly. It gives you perhaps the smoothest picture of the core momentum in wage price growth.
And like seasonal adjustment, were trend estimates also affected by COVID?
Yes, they were suspended for the same period from June 2020 to June 2022. It was just too difficult during that time to be confident about what the true underlying trend was, given the massive disruptions. Were these huge swings temporary or a fundamental shift? Hard to say in real time.
So they stopped publishing them until the picture became clearer.
Correct. They were reinstated in June 2022 when the series had become more stable and predictable again.
So just to recap the data types, you have the original index numbers, which are the raw inputs tracking specific jobs, then seasonally adjusted, which takes out the predictable timing effects, and finally trend, which smooths things out even more to show the underlying direction.
That's a good summary.
And one final check on data quality. Are the main WPI numbers ever revised after they're first published?
The original index numbers, the ones that aren't seasonally adjusted or trended, are considered final when they are published. They would only ever be revised in really exceptional circumstances, like if a major error was discovered in the source data or processing. It's very rare.
But the adjusted ones can change.
Yes. As we mentioned with concurrent seasonal adjustment, the seasonally adjusted and the trend estimates can be subject to minor revisions in subsequent quarters. This isn't because of errors, it's just an inherent part of the statistical process. The models get slightly better estimates of past seasonal patterns and the underlying trend as more data points become available over time.
Right. The models learn and refine as they get more information. That makes complete sense. Wow. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the core idea of measuring that pure wage price change
To how they meticulously sample and track those specific jobs over years.
explored the really crucial layers of weighting needed to make the sample reflect the whole economy's wage bill.
Looked at how to interpret the index numbers as measures of change, not level.
And then dug into those important statistical adjustments for seasonality and trend, plus the nuances of revisions.
It really underscores that the WPI, that headline figure, is actually a highly specific and frankly sophisticated statistical measure.
It's not just a simple average of pay rises.
Not at all. It's carefully engineered to isolate just one thing: the change in the rate of pay for a fixed unit of labor, deliberately filtering out all those other factors like promotions, performance bonuses, changes in hours, or experience gains.
And understanding that whole methodology, all those steps we discussed, is really key to properly interpreting what the WPI is telling us.
And perhaps more importantly, what it isn't telling us about the broader labor market or individual pay packets.
Yeah, it definitely means you can't just see a, say, 3% WPI rise and assume everyone's total pay went up by 3%. That's not what it measures.
Absolutely not. And that brings us to a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to ponder. Given that the WPI is so specifically designed to exclude changes related to the quality of work like promotions or added responsibilities, and the quantity of work like hours worked or output-based bonuses, what other information, what other data or factors do you really need to consider when you're thinking about changes in your own total compensation package? Or, looking more broadly, when you're trying to assess the overall health, dynamism, and maybe even the productivity story of the wider labor market, beyond just this single, albeit important, measure of pure wage price pressure.